Hello, you've reached Lisa Talking again, and we've reached part 2 of our look at ancient Mesopotamia from Eden to Iraq. Now, in the first part, we looked at the origins of ancient Mesopotamian civilization as it emerged from the Ice Age. We looked at its role at the roots of our own civilization and the contribution it's made, and we looked at the way it was formed by people coming down from the Eurasian steppe and the belief systems that embedded in the structure of this early society. We noted that it was a reflection of an earlier civilization from Neolithic China that had roots in the Yellow River and Mount Song. And we looked at the fact that it seemed like a political break away from this civilization and the way that it had then been shaped by the Indus Valley civilization. And we noted that it was represented in the biblical tale of Eden in the book of Genesis. Now, what I would like to do today is continue to look at how we can use the book of Genesis to kind of map out the development of Mesopotamian civilization. And then to look at the kind of end period of that and the rise of Babylonian dominance and what that indicates for this civilization. But then also to look at the significance that this early Mesopotamian civilization has for the later Islamic Empire. Now, I'm not going to look at the period where it was under Ottoman rule, because I'm actually going to look at the Ottomans in a video about Turkey in a few weeks. But I am going to look at the last century and the impact of Western dominance on this civilization, and particularly the oil-based economy. Now, when you are using biblical texts as historical sources, which you can do very easily and usefully for this particular civilization, it's really important to understand how those texts are constructed. Now, parable writing is a very, very simple but very clever form of very symbolic writing, which uses symbols and strips identity details out from people, so it creates stories that stick in the mind and then can be exchanged easily, particularly in civilizations where there may not be a massive level of literacy. Also these stories were designed to form the foundation of systems of governance, education and law, and also the transmission of history. Now, this particular form of writing that we kind of are familiar with through the Bible and through the Quran actually has roots in early Mesopotamian writing and in the much earlier writing evidenced in things like the Book of Changes, which is at the core of the I Ching. Now, when I first shared this this stuff in a bunch of videos that I did over Christmas, I had looked at how to use religious texts as historical sources, and I'd actually broken down the stories in the Bible in sequence, but it kind of came to feel a bit like, if I'm honest, Lisa names people in the Bible, when in actual fact what I was trying to do was use these texts to get insight into a wider historical context. But in order to actually use these texts to actually understand, the Bible literally maps out the political development of the Eurasian steppe for several thousand years. And in order to use these texts that way, you have to identify the first person in the Bible. Now, the first kind of person mentioned in the Bible is not actually named, and in the Hebrew, it's actually El Issa. So El is an epithet that means God, and Issa means woman. And El Issa refers to the fact that the original high priestesses at the core of the belief system that shapes Mesopotamia were women that it was perceived that God spoke through directly. These were the high priestesses, often referred to as goddesses. One of the names that's used is Ninhursag, which means sacred lady of the mountain. And it's perceived that this is like the name of a goddess, but this is actually kind of referring to these women. And the first person that's actually named in the Bible is Adam. Now, underneath, I've put 4 pieces of early Mesopotamian writing, which are a very particular cycle around a guy called Lugalband. Lugalband was a king of Uruk, and he has the epithet of the first shepherd king. Now, if you read Josephus, who is a Jewish historian writing in the 1st century, he is quite expansive about the shepherd kings and their role in Jewish history. The Hebrew alphabet, the letter Lamed, is a shepherd's crook, and it represents worldly power. In the Quran, there are several chapters headed with 3 letters, Alif, Lam, Mem. Alif is the letter that represents the word of God. Lam represents Lamed, the shepherd's crook, and worldly power. And Mem represents the waters or the flood, and represents these early belief systems that originate on the Eurasian steppe. Now, when it's in the Quran, it means it's a new page of covenant. Flood is a motif that represents a renewal. It replaces and washes away what went before. Now, in the writings about Lugalband, these are really, really important writings that tell you about changes that kind of happened to alter the structure of Mesopotamian society and systems. So Lugalband is the shepherd king, and he is he's noted as the shepherd king who married or fell in love with Ninsun, who was a goddess, one of these high priestesses. Now, these were women who it was perceived that God spoke directly through. If you go to the earlier Chinese mythology, Nuar is said to have a divine consort. In later Armenian mythology, they have Haldi as a divine consort. And this marriage of a high priestess to a king is the marrying of the power of these systems to the power of kingship. And in actual fact, in most modern monarchies in the world, this is still the case. In our own coronation ceremony, we still anoint the queen with holy oil, and she's seen as ordained by God. Now, there are several changes to Mesopotamian society which are evident in these pieces of writing, which are highly symbolic. So they are written in a period, they describe the development that this civilization's undergone. There are city-states warring with each other, and they have learned to kind of manage a canal system. Now, the canal system in ancient Mesopotamia is really, really important. Without this system, the civilization could not flourish. This is a place where the land, if you over-cultivate it, it develops salt on the surface and it becomes unusable. So creating a supply of fresh water that will irrigate is what allows this civilization to basically function. It's actually the canal system and the building of it that gave us the earliest mathematics from this civilization that's often misleadingly called Babylonian mathematics, but comes from here. Now, alongside the management of the canals, what was also required was the cultivation of date palms. Date palm is an incredibly important tree symbolically and practically for this civilization. These trees would sit alongside the canals and they would help the maintenance of fresh water. But these trees had to be hand pollinated. They needed human intervention, and they formed the center of sacred practice. Iconography about the priestesses for thousands of years always contains pictures of date palms. And in actual fact, you can identify where items come from by the type and shape of the date palm tree that they actually show. The date palm takes about 50 to 70 years to mature and then produces lots and lots of fruit the older it gets, and they become a symbol of both welfare systems and later on economic independence for women in civilizations in Syria, where women often own date palm orchards as their livelihood. Now, Lugalband, this is the civilization. They are at this point, they are cultivating, they have this high priest system, they have this water management system, and this change has happened where Lugalband and Ninsun are now a partnership, and the power of kingship is tied to the power of these high priestesses. But what's also contained in this little literary cycle of kind of 4 pieces is power over language, and kind of in the Quran, it says that God taught Adam the names of things, and that's what's represented in these pieces of writing. Now, if you speak to linguists about ancient Mesopotamia, they will tell you about the Sumerian problem. Sumerian is a language isolate. It doesn't bear any relation to the languages around it. It's not, and that's partially, you're talking about a civilization where this is language that's actually controlled and managed and is actually devised, and this becomes the basis of the language that is used for the Bible. Now, the later language, Sumerian is a language isolate, and then later it's replaced by another language, Akkadian, and this confuses linguists because there's no corresponding migration. That's because the alteration in language is very much from these roots, and it's altered as a political choice. And contained within these writings around Lugalband is the first incidence of the story of the Tower of Babel, where God alters the languages. This is the first time that this appears, long before Genesis comes into existence. Now, the story of Adam and Eve, actually, this is represented in the story of the tree, the serpent, and the apple, and this is actually very directly referring to this man, Lugalband. It's represented in later mythology. There's stuff about Enki and Ninsun. There's other mythology that actually refers back to this. Now, the next stage in the book of Genesis that comes after Adam and Eve is their children, Cain and Abel. But this is again a symbolic story which is about the next stage in Sumeria, in Mesopotamian civilization. The story of Cain and Abel. Cain slews Abel over his sister wife in a dispute over a field and sacrificial practices. This is a reference to a specific conflict between two city-states, Umma and Lagash. They are in conflict and dispute over a 30-kilometer piece of land, and this gives rise to the first peace treaty in existence, the Mesalim Treaty. The instability of Umma and Lagash allows a man called Lugalband to rise, and he then conquers many city-states and moves away from this kind of system with the high priestesses at its core and abandons this. And in the document that's actually represented in Genesis as the mark of Cain, you can see that the high priestesses are asked what they're going to do about it. Now, the next story in the Bible that's relevant to Mesopotamian civilization is the story of Enoch, who walks with God. Now, Enoch very directly references a man called Sargon of Akkad, who is the first emperor. Now, he is able to take back the territories that Lugalband is actually kind of responsible for conquering, and he places the high priestesses back at the center of governance. This is why he is said to have walked with God. It's actually his daughter, Hodwana, he makes the high priestess. Now, Sargon of Akkad is the first incident that I know of, although maybe earlier, I'm not sure, of the motif that's represented later in Moses' stories about the baby who's rescued in the basket by the flood. The flood in these narratives is symbolic and represents the power of these high priestesses, and later comes to represent the power of the interlinked harem systems and the female kind of people within royal houses who are actually part of this power network. These are very symbolic stories. Now, the daughter of Sargon of Akkad, Hodwana, is actually the first named author on the planet, and it's through her writings that we get insight into the position of high priestess and the instability and the kind of conflict that they are constantly navigating. Now, Hodwana is the first named author on the planet, and you can actually see symbolism and phrases from her writing repeated in the Bible, in the New Testament, written in the first century. Direct phrases. You can actually trace a direct transmission from the New Testament in the 1st century back to these people here. Now, through Hodwana we find, and through the high priestesses within this civilization, we find another recurring theme, the theme of sacred marriage. Once this power transfer that Lugalband and Ninsun represent, these women who are seen as gods having spoken through, their role, part of their role is very much around sacred marriage and about them having, like, some things reproduce around women reliably, and there's a reason there are beds in Mesopotamian iconography related to the high priestesses. But what's also evident in Hodwana's writing is a lament at this actual earlier decision to kind of link the high priestesses with kingship, and the way that this distracts from their role as responsible shepherdesses responsible for welfare systems. She regrets the headdress of the high priestess, and this, like in her laments about I think there's a distinct possibility that she's the author of the Epic of Gilgamesh, which also kind of laments and kind of hopes for a time when kingship and this power will no longer be linked. Now, the most important story by far in Genesis regarding Mesopotamian civilization is the story of Noah and his family. But what you have to be careful of with these texts is the Bible has one dynastic line running through it. And if you just rely on this dynastic line, you often are missing what's really happened in the historical context. Now, Noah represents the first monarch of the third dynasty of Ur, which is the start of the Neo-Sumerian Empire, which is a very great height for this early Mesopotamian civilization. But between Sargon-of-Akkad, between the Akkadian Empire, which descends because of instability, because of oppression and rebellions that they can't deal with, because they're not working well with city-states and with the mountain peoples, and because there are very, very awful sacrificial practices, another dynasty emerges called the Gutians. Now, the Gutians are directly people from the mountains and the steppe, and they form a dynasty, but they actually don't keep any written records, so we don't know what happens. But what we do know is that in order to stabilize, in every stage of religious covenant that's represented in the Bible after that, there is a tribal federation model at its core. Christopher Beckwith is clear in his Empires of the Silk Road that tribal federation defines the political organization of the steppe from the beginning. And you can, like the actual flood that's represented in the flood narrative, while it may be a real flood because this is actually a land that exists on a floodplain, it refers to political instability. The flood is represented in the Quran as coming down from the hills. The Gutians are the flood that Noah has to navigate. Now, the story of Noah and the flood is incredibly symbolic. In the actual original Mesopotamian literature, you'll find that the ark has what looks like the modern Kaaba from Mecca on it. This is a symbol of resurrection. The flood itself is a symbol of resurrection and about renewal. But in the story about the flood, Noah actually he sends forward first from the ark a raven, and it is denied. Now, this raven represents the religious practices that had defined the Akkadian Empire, that had led women like her and Hodwana to say, why must women die for their holy, holy songs? The religious covenant that Noah represents contains a stipulation about lifeblood. This is about live sacrifice. This is very early and very brutal society. Now, the reign of Ur-Nammu, who is represented by Noah, is defined by placing the power of the high priestesses back at the center of governance. And in the story of the flood, he sends forward the holy dove, who is actually not a bird, but a woman, and is his wife Nama, the high priestess. And it's she who acts as his peace emissary, but it says that she comes back no more. He doesn't have her anymore. And then later it says that Shem, Noah's son, covers his nakedness with a blanket. And when you look at the reign of Ur-Nammu, what you find is that Ur-Nammu is killed very quickly because he can't stop fighting with the Gutians. And it's actually his son Shulgi who's the most successful monarch of the third dynasty of Ur. Shulgi is represented as Shem at the foundation of the Torah. Now, Shulgi reigns for a really long time. I think it's 49 years, but I haven't checked, and I don't want to restart this video in case I'm wrong. So if I'm wrong, I'm really sorry. But his reign is very successful on one hand, is at the core of kind of really reorganizing the boundaries of the Neo-Sumerian Empire, of creating like a civil service class. His bureaucratic management is excellent. He introduces the Ur-Nammu law code, which is one of the first extant law codes in history. He has a reputation as an enlightened king, and he manages to maintain stability for quite some time. And the way that kind of Shulgi's reign is undermined is actually in like he ends up fighting again with the Gutians, but he actually is one of the most successful kings in Mesopotamian history. Now, this kind of period covered by the third dynasty of Ur, like the next time it's mentioned, like Abraham and Sarah. Sarah is literally the last high priestess of Ur in the Bible, and it's them leaving that actually marks a transition of the Bible to Egyptian civilization, which I'm going to discuss next week and the week after. Now, this period in Mesopotamian history is incredibly special at the core of all the Abrahamic faiths, but I'm not the first person ever, I'd love to be, who knew this. This is actually understood for a very, very long time and is transmitted kind of in the systems which actually transmit the authority behind the Bible. We can see evidence of this nowhere is evidence of this more clear than in the Islamic Empire. Now, in the Ibn Ishaq biography of Muhammad, there is a description of Abu Bakr being the holder of genealogies which go back to the Sumerian kings list. This is knowledge that is already understood. In the fighting in the kind of period where the Rashidun Caliphate are actually securing the Islamic Empire, they come up against the Sassanids, who are a dynasty from Persia, and the location of their fighting is around what we would call modern day Basra, but this is about protection of this earlier sacred site of Eridu and recognition of this. There are stories, the black stone I think that actually is in the mosque at Mecca is related to Magan, the period of Adam and Eve. Muhammad regularly talks about the period around Adam and Eve, and he's referring back to this civilization. Now, in the period after the first 4 rightly guided caliphs, there is then a period where a dynasty kind of emerged, the Umayyad dynasty, and they have control of the Islamic Empire. And it's kind of under the excesses of the Umayyad dynasty that you see the emergence of the Abbasid Caliphate. The Umayyads kind of are ruling from Syria. The Abbasid Caliphate make their power base in this territory. And what I wanted to talk to you about is how Baghdad came into being. Like, Baghdad was a circular city that was built with the House of Wisdom in it. And this was a center of learning that we actually don't get taught about at all in the West. But in actual fact, without what happened here in Baghdad, nothing that then happened in the West could have happened. Within Baghdad, and the Enlightenment could have happened, that couldn't have happened. The Renaissance couldn't have happened. Within the kind of this system under the Islamic Caliphate, it's actually described often as the Islamic Golden Age, and we see a recovery of classical knowledge and a synthesizing of knowledge from different systems, from different civilizations, that gives us the roots of scientific method. It gives us the roots of mathematics. It gives us the roots of modern medicine. It gives us the roots of modern philosophy. The recovery of classical knowledge that happens here means that we have actual access to this classical knowledge, and it would have been lost otherwise. Like, I have a bit of an obsession with 11th century kind of Britain and Norman women, and particularly Emma of Normandy. And if I could do a history masters, I would do a thesis on her. But if somebody offered me a time machine with one journey, this is where I would go. What happens here in Baghdad, in this civilization that is actually kind of drawing on traditions from this much earlier Mesopotamian civilization, is the lights go on for the world. This is one of the most important civilizations in human history, and there's actually very little to compare to the intellectual explosion that happens here. Now, this civilization is very old and continues, but I'm not going to talk about Ottoman rule. But the reason I need you to kind of mention that this kind of civilization comes under Ottoman rule is that this continues until World War I. And the last century, like, modern economics is basically, page 1 of modern economics is John Maynard Keynes' Economic Consequence of the Peace, which was written about the Treaty of Versailles and the agreements that kind of emerged from the peace treaty at the end of World War I. He said this is going to generate conflict, which it absolutely did, and it led directly to World War II. But the 20th century, kind of the boundaries that were dictated here in World War I actually shaped modern Iraq. And modern Iraq has been shaped since very much by the agreements made here, and then our dependence on oil as an economy. And as we kind of reach up the point at the beginning of the 21st century where we're kind of looking to end our oil dependence, because actually I would dispute how much oil there is actually left in Iraq. And as the economics that was born here at World War One ends and we move into this multipolar world where UK-US dominance is over and where the UK have danced ourselves off the world stage, we are now all looking east to the economic infrastructure of the world, which is being laid across what we euphemistically call the Silk Roads, these civilizations between here and China. Now, I don't think anybody has to kind of say what foreign policy has been in Iraq in the last kind of 30 years, but I wanted to tell you the story of a river. Now, when I opened these videos, I discussed that Iraq was the plain between two rivers, and I discussed that Eridu, the city represented as the biblical Eden, had kind of grown up where the Euphrates and the Tigris became one river. Now, in actual fact, this confluence still exists, and in the West we call it the Shatt al-Arab River, but in Arabic it's called the Dijla al-Awara River, and in Iran it's called the Avand Rod. Now, this river, where the Euphrates and the Tigris are they run as one river, is actually the site of biblical Eden, and it used to be the site of one of the biggest date palm forests in the world. But it was actually a specific target in the 2003 invasion of Iraq, and in the Iran-Iraq war it was actually very, very harsh, very badly damaged in what was called Operation Ramadan. Now, where I live, Operation Ramadan is a cooking operation, and mostly these trees are either gone or in very, very poor condition. But when I was actually studying for these videos, I looked at how they actually built these canal systems in ancient Mesopotamia. And what was really, really shocking to me was they couldn't actually do this in modern Iraq, because the problem here is not just the damage to these trees, it's the chemical residue of the wars that have taken place here for the last 30 years that mean before they could even begin to grow the date palms and kind of fix what's going on at this river, the ground would have to decontaminate. Now, we are looking to learn about the Silk Roads and all these economic and political and trading relationships that have formed the civilization between Europe and China. But as we kind of move into a world where we can't afford to have our behavior remain unspoken, that's actually going to mean that each time we have this conversation about these civilizations and the depth of them and the importance of them, the top end of it is going to be a conversation about the impact of our intervention. Now, I very much enjoyed researching ancient Mesopotamia, and as a white British woman, I'm kind of ashamed at how I have to end this video. But next week I will be coming back with a video looking at kind of the civilization that moves up the Fertile Crescent, with particular focus on the Jordan Valley, the land that's called Canaan in the Bible and is actually at the site of modern day Israel. So that will be next Sunday. I'll try and get it uploaded in the morning so that it's available all day, and thank you very much for listening to me today.